We can start now. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar of the Essex University Human Rights Centre on the relevance of social science and history to the theory and practice of human rights today and tomorrow. My name is Michael Freeman. I'm an emeritus professor in the Department of Government at Essex University. We are delighted to welcome our three guests. Samuel Moyn is Professor of Jurisprudence and History at Yale University. He's the author of a number of important works in the history, philosophy, and politics of human rights, including The Last Utopia, Human Rights in History, and Not Enough, Human Rights in an Unequal World. Robert Lamb is Professor of Political Philosophy at Exeter University. He is author of Thomas Paine and the Idea of Human Rights and the article Historicizing the Idea of Human Rights. He's currently working on a book about the concept of political hope. Anne-Marie Clark is an Associate Professor of Political Science and co-director of the Human Rights Studies program at Purdue University in Indiana. She's author of Diplomacy of Conscience, Amnesty International and Changing Human Rights Norms, Demands of Justice, the Creation of a Global Human Rights Practice, and with Kathryn Sikkink, an important article, Information Effects and Human Rights. Is the good news about increased human rights information bad news for human rights measures? She has an MA degree from Essex University, so welcome back, Anne. I will begin with a brief presentation of some of the principal themes for my book, Human Rights, which is to be published by Polity Press this week, so almost no one has read it yet. I will then invite our panelists to make brief opening statements. We will then proceed to discussion, at which point I hope we can address some brilliant questions from you, the audience, so please keep your questions coming. This webinar was prompted by the publication of the 4th edition of my book, Human Rights. This book was originally commissioned in 1999 by Polity Press for their series, Key Concepts in Social Science. I accepted the commission because I believe that human rights was not a key concept in the social science and felt challenged to explain why this was so. At that time, there were very few social science works about human rights. Why was this? There may have been political reasons. That is, the concept of human rights was simply not sufficiently salient at that time. There were, however, philosophical reasons. Social science was strongly influenced by the positive philosophical tradition that required science to be objective and value-free. The concept of human rights seemed to be normative, legalistic, and moralistic, and therefore perhaps not suited to social science. There were also related historical reasons. The 19th century pioneers of social science rejected the idea of the rights of man or natural rights that had inspired the French Revolution on the grounds that it was antisocial and unscientific. When the United Nations adopted the concept of human rights in its Charter of 1945 and its Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, it ignored the 19th century social scientific criticisms of the rights of man or natural rights and failed to provide a new philosophical grounding apart from an arguably vague reference to human dignity. Samuel Moyn has argued that the concept of human rights emerged only in the 1970s as an international moral movement to constrain the sovereignty of nation states. It was therefore different from the French revolutionary concept of the rights of man that was concerned with affirming the sovereignty of the nation state. Moyn acknowledges both continuity and discontinuity between the French revolutionary conception and that of the contemporary human rights movement, but argues that discontinuities are more significant than continuities because they show that the concept of human rights is historically contingent and leaves us free to change it if we come to believe that to be appropriate. Robert Lamb criticizes this argument by making a distinction between human rights ideas and actions. He finds continuity between the French Revolutionary idea of rights and the contemporary concept of human rights, but holds that the actions that follow from these ideas will vary from time to time. However, he rejects human rights histories that reach back to ancient times to find general ideas such as ethical universalism, because ethical universalism may be incompatible with human rights, as, for example, in utilitarianism. My view is that so-called deep history can be justified as relevant to our understanding and evaluation of the contemporary concept and practice of human rights, because this concept includes various ideas, including ethical universalism, that are controversial now and have been controversial since ancient times. Excavating the deep assumptions of human rights through deep history helps to clarify the strengths and weaknesses of contemporary human rights theory and practice. Critics of the deep history of human rights object that it is unilinear, teleological, committed to a discredited idea of inevitable progress, and triumphalist. It may be, but is not necessarily any of these things. The history of human rights is extremely complex, with advances and setbacks, opportunities taken and dead ends gone down, and involvement with ideas and actions we now think incompatible with human rights, such as sexism, racism, and colonialism. The present state of human rights is contingent in that it might have been different and might be different in future. History illuminates, but does not determine the nature or value of the concept. How then is the history related to the social science of human rights? Since 2000, there have been considerable developments in the social science of human rights, including political science, international relations, sociology, social psychology, anthropology, and economics. Prominent has been quantitative political science, which has addressed a question largely ignored by human rights lawyers. Does human rights law improve the enjoyment of human rights? Early studies generally supported a skeptical view of international human rights law. States ratifying international human rights treaties generally improve their human rights performance only slightly or not at all. Indeed, sometimes treaty ratification was followed by worse performance. Later studies using different statistical methods and differentiating between countries, the human rights studied, and timeframes came up with more nuanced conclusions. International human rights law is sometimes associated with improved respect for some human rights under some conditions. Peace, democracy, strong civil societies, and independent judiciaries are not only associated with better human rights performance by governments, but improve the effectiveness of human rights law. There has been an inconclusive debate between pessimists writing books with such titles as The End Times of Human Rights, Stephen Hopgood, and The Twilight of Human Rights Law, Eric Posner, and cautious optimists such as Kathryn Sikkink with her book, Evidence for Hope. Some, including Anne-Marie Clark, have argued that an unjustified pessimism has been influenced by a so-called information effect. There are more human rights investigators than ever before. They have more effective methods. Some countries are more open to investigation, and the human rights field has expanded to include, for example, LGBTQI+ rights. Consequently, more and better information about human rights violations is now available, creating the false impression that respect for human rights has declined. The information effect thesis is, however, controversial. Ironically, while the deep history of human rights has been criticized for being triumphalist, it has recently been deployed to support pessimistic conclusions about the contemporary human rights movement. Adam Chilton and Eric Posner have questioned explanations of variations in countries' respect for human rights on the basis of current conditions, such as democracy and civil war, or events from the recent past, such as human rights treaty ratification. Their research suggests that factors with deep historical roots, such as geography, institutions, and culture, affect human rights today. Critics have countered that human rights performance may often be best explained by short-term factors. For example, Argentine defeat in the Falklands War explains Argentina's transformation from dictatorship to democracy. However, David Cingranelli and Mikhail Filippov have argued that there are two groups of countries in the world, one in which human rights have improved and another in which they have not. History, geography, culture, institutions, state capacity, and long-term challenges determine in which of these groups a country will be found. Legal commitments, such as treaty ratifications and reform movements, may sometimes lead to human rights improvements, but these are likely to be short-lived as they run up against long-term cultural, structural constraints. I propose 9 lessons for lawyers and activists from the history and social science of human rights. 1. Social science inherits from the history of human rights a complex and controversial mix of empirical and normative commitments that need to be clarified and evaluated to avoid intellectual confusion and unwarranted assumptions. 2. The history of human rights is long-term in that the problem of abuse of power and various concepts of rights have existed for many centuries. The problems and available solutions change over time. Understanding the current state and future prospects for human rights requires both long-term and short-term perspectives. 3. The deep history of countries and of the international system have a significant impact on the current state and prospects for human rights, but activist agency also contributes to human rights improvements. 4. Empirical social science evidence suggests that some optimistic assumptions of human rights lawyers and activists may not be warranted, but it also clarifies the conditions under which law and activism can be effective. 5. Human rights law is not the only means to advance human rights and is often not the most effective. However, the combination of human rights law and politics is often effective. Law and politics interact with each other and can advance each other. 6. Quantitative social science is controversial among quantitative social scientists, some of whom are optimists while others are pessimists. Optimism and pessimism are moral, not scientific attitudes, although they should be informed by the relevant science. 7. Quantitative social science has studied a limited range of human rights. It has emphasized civil and political rather than economic, social, and cultural rights, and has had little to say about so-called new human rights, such as LGBTIQ+ and disability rights. 8. Large-scale quantitative social scientific studies should be integrated with critical case studies of human rights successes and failures. The state of human rights should be linked to the so-called crisis of liberal democracy. Right, that's my introduction. I'd like to now I suggest that perhaps we could start with the following question and invite Sam Moyne to perhaps kick us off. What, Sam, do you think is the relevance of the history of human rights to human rights social scientists, lawyers, and activists? And any other thoughts you might want to share with us will be welcome, of course.
Well, to begin with, congratulations to Michael. I think it's incredibly self-effacing that he's taken what I'm sure we would have all have loved to be a celebration of his book, you know, and transformed it into a very general debate. And that's incredibly honorable. All right, I'll answer the question. My understanding is I should take 5 minutes. And let me just make a couple of other comments, as part of, facing that really important question. First, briefly on human rights in the history of the social sciences. I'm not sure it's accurate to suggest that social scientists before recently rejected human rights. I mean, Emil Durkheim didn't. In his classic credo, Individualism and the Intellectuals, he suggested that human rights were the content of a kind of modern religion of solidarity, kind of our version of the kinds of totemic beliefs and practices that he studied among so-called primitive peoples. And I would be the first to insist that his understanding of human rights was not the same as our own, but it's a major counterexample to any generalization. And Durkheim is important enough that it matters. I'd further argue that there are other examples in the intellectual history of so-called social science that prove that human rights, in some understanding, were not totally foreign to its intellectual history. But I am notorious, as Michael indicated, for claiming that our understanding is new. And so let me make a few comments indirectly facing his question. First, I want to resist the idea that ethical universalism is either new or controversial. Actually, as I read the ethical history of humanity, far from involving a move from family, tribe, and nation in search of the kind of belated insight that we're all human beings, that insight is, litters the annals. And the main issue is that nobody can agree what our common humanity implies or requires. What was the, battle of Christianity and Islam, which some people think is still going on, but a contest of universalisms? What was the Cold War? Though neither side really championed human rights, they championed a plan for humanity. And so as I see it, human rights should be seen in kind of global terms as a latecomer, maybe part of the fallout of this really millennial struggle of universalisms with one another, something I assume will continue. Now, it's true that I argued many years ago now that human rights in our understanding came about, pretty recently. I want to concede to Michael and Robert that at a certain level of abstraction, of course there are conceptual continuities, and there's a genuine debate about how far back the let's call it the very idea of human rights goes. Maybe I'll shock Robert by saying that not only is that clear, but it goes very far back, maybe as far as the Middle Ages. But what's at stake is how interesting it is, how important what we learn by insisting on continuity rather than discontinuity at the level of abstract concept. And furthermore, you can, place pressure on this kind of the let's call it easy distinction between ideas and their application. And I actually think sociology, and if you want to call it social science, is incredibly useful in kind of cautioning us against a kind of philosophical move that would suggest that social action can be conceived of as involving first an idea and then an application of the idea. And if that's true, then maybe we should focus less on abstract conceptual continuity In any case, however one comes out on that sort of debate, Michael's totally right that I've focused not so much on the concept of human rights, but on the political projects that people have justified in the name of human rights. And it's true that I've claimed that the kind of thing we're seeing today is pretty new. I mean, we haven't talked about it yet, but since no one's offered an argument against that proposition on the Zoom yet, I'll just leave it. Maybe we'll come back to it. I think there's an increasing amount of history that shows that there was intergovernmental action around human rights in the 1940s, but little transformation of world politics, especially from a mobilizational perspective, until decades later. If I stand by, that proposition, which seems as true as any. So what's then the deep history, relevance of deep history? That was Michael's question. I'm just not sure. I don't know of any relevance. I mean, it is true to say the conceptual foundations of human rights can be said to be old. So what? I don't know. I don't have an answer to that question. I do think, as Michael implied, I think correctly, that focusing on the recent contingency of human rights in application, if you want to say it that way, is really useful, because we look at its limits, its world historical conditions. And if we're interested in human rights or morality generally, we can ask, well, what do we do with this political project to save it from its limits or to do better? So I'll close with comments about social science, optimism, and pessimism. I'm obviously not that enamored with social science. It seems like it overstates its epistemological certainty. I think the attempt to measure the impact of human rights treaties kind of was a really interesting project for 10 years, but we just find contending studies, and we're not getting what we're supposed to get, which is a really credible warrant for action. And anyway, if we learn that there are limits, we have to kind of think very broadly about what the limits to human rights are in practice. I'd say they're pretty clear that human rights have proved hostage to various mistakes that have been made. So we know that human rights are most under threat when war happens. And yet human rights have gotten detached from the ideal of peace, approximately actually in the period of their fame. I think we also can see that backlash at human rights, which is too recent to really measure amongst these so-called empiricists, seems, at least in part, to be driven by economic affairs, including, class stagnation, or even growing inequality in some places. And if that's true, then it turns out human rights as a selective set of values are hostage to, broader events in the history of social justice. And if that's true, I think, we ought to figure out how to proceed in response. So from the perspective of optimism or pessimism, I never set out to be a pessimist about human rights. I set out to call for a greater optimism. And it seems as if today we should conclude that if we don't link human rights more to the peace movement, more to socialist movements, then they will remain hostage to their limitations, which seem glaring and graphic right now. Thanks very much, and congratulations to Michael.
Thank you very much indeed, Sam. I was thinking of postponing the optimism, pessimism question. You're not most interesting on that, but a little later, and looking at the social science in more detail. But perhaps I could invite Robert now to say something about how valuable history is or not.
Thanks, Michael. I'm not. I like Samuel. I'm a bit unsure about the value of history. Seems to be somewhat contingent, I think. But I guess what the question that that you framed that really piqued my interest is the one about, does the history of human rights undermine contemporary human rights by showing that it is merely contingent? And that links back to some of the things that Samuel says. But first off, I should also say huge congratulations on the 4th edition of your book. It's a tremendous book. It's so erudite and is so valuable to both scholars and teachers of human rights. So thank you for that, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this seminar. So I've got to confess that I'm not really an historian, and so I thought, since Samuel is a historian and Anne-Marie is a political scientist, it might be most useful if I come at these questions from a perspective of a normative political theorist, someone most interested in the normative value of human rights. And so this is why I got interested in this question that you identified about the whether or not the history of human rights reveals its mere contingency and therefore its lack of value. And I suppose I want to kind of have my cake and eat it. I want to sort of say that, yes, the idea of human rights is we can endorse and embrace the historical contingency of human rights or any other aspect of our normative vocabulary, and nevertheless try and articulate why it's valuable, when it's valuable, and how we can make it more valuable. And I think that this is a bit of a strange move. It's unusual in normative theory because it's unusual to try and marry historicist commitments on the one hand with the universalism of human rights. And most normative reflection about human rights tends to be universalistic, which is in some sense unsurprising, because human rights, in some regard, it's a universalistic idea. It seems to conjure a moral world that knows no boundaries, it can't be restricted with context or culture or otherwise sovereign borders. It's a universal idea and attracts universalistic analysis from normative theorists. Nevertheless, I want to hold on to this idea that we can be historicists and nevertheless see the value in the idea of human rights. And I think that my commitment to that idea really draws on the belief that arbitrariness does not follow from mere contingency. And that's an idea that I'm particularly attached to at the moment because I'm teaching Hegel. But the idea that contingency means that, you know, the normative values we've inherited from the past need not have been inherited. They need not be passed on to the future. They have no existence in nature, but that doesn't make them valueless. It doesn't make them unimportant. Rather, we have to decide how best to rethink them, improve upon them, and either endorse or reject them should we wish to. And I think some political theorists do grapple with that task. I think people like John Rawls and Richard Rorty are two examples of historicist political theorists who nevertheless want to say something positive about human rights and try and think about ways to either improve them or articulate them in a way they haven't been articulated before. But I think that the dominant gaze in political theory is very much anti-historicist. And I want to identify two different approaches that I think sort of fail to live up to this contingency. The first is the sort of moral approach that you mentioned in the book, the James Griffin approach, which sort of the late James Griffin, the Oxford moral philosopher, whose book on human rights posits a universal metaphysical set of interests that we all share, from which he then derives the meaning of human rights as a political concept. And that obviously denies contingency because these are universal eternal interests. But on the other hand, the practice-based understanding of human rights that we see in writers like Charles Bates and Andrea Sangiovanni and Joseph Raz, these thinkers think that normative discussions of human rights must defer to the role of human rights in the international state system and through the practices, institutions, and structures of global politics. And I think that no less than Griffin's approach also denies the fundamental contingency and malleability of human rights, because they derive the definition of human rights from what they claim is an established political reality. And I think that we can resist that as well. So I think that then links to what I would describe as the dialectic of disquiet we see in the fifth chapter of your new edition of the book, which you seem to, on the one hand, you really get worried about the positivism of social science, then you swing over and you really get worried about the relativism of more anthropological and historical approaches. And I guess I want to say, in defense of the interpretivist historical anthropological approach to human rights, I think that one thing that can do is it can give voice, it can take human rights away from the gaze of a detached scholar, whether it's the moralist or the institutionalist, and it can instead try and figure out what human rights means to those on the ground who are reclaiming it as an idea, those from marginalized communities who are now speaking the language of human rights, despite any lingering associations it has with, cultural or indeed military Western imperialism. You see all kinds of communities, the trans community, for instance, at the moment, are speaking the language of human rights. And I think that that kind of anthropological, interpretivist social science can allow us to at once see its contingency, its historicism, but also its potentially emancipatory potential. So I will leave it there.
All right, thanks very much. That was extremely interesting. Anne, perhaps you'd like to say something. I don't know whether you see connections between political science and history, but anyway, please comment on these historical issues, if you will.
Thank you. Well, I also want to congratulate you, Michael, on the new book. I'm using the third edition right now in class, so we're all waiting for the fourth edition to come out. And I really appreciate the chance to participate in this conversation. And I've enjoyed both of the speakers' comments already. I have some notes written, so I may read part of them. In different ways, everybody on the panel, I think, has written about what we can learn by viewing human rights as a concept and practice that has changed and is changing. And Michael, you asked me to talk a little bit about this information effects question. I think the change issue includes the interpretation of information that's been collected about rights-related violations over time by social scientists. And that article you mentioned from 2013, Kathryn Sikkink and I published this paper in Human Rights Quarterly about some of the conclusions being drawn from studies that use data that translated the content of annual human rights reports into numeric codes. And as has been noted, some of the studies based on these data were arguing that human rights treaties either made no difference or were correlated with worse performance. And now we have some studies that correlate it with somewhat better performance. At that time, my view was that the design of some of these studies were ignoring things that practitioners and activists knew. And first was that the socialization effects of treaty ratification, if there were any, would probably not be visible within the data that were commonly used to assess respect for human rights. And second, human rights reporting itself has been uneven historically, and not uneven in a random way. It was especially so in the earliest years of reports that the major human rights data sets are based on. So we can't assume that gaps in the level of reporting have been randomly spotty over time. There's certainly more information now, which is good. And that's one of the things Kathryn and I, that was in the title. But that may mean that more information could be a proxy for worse assessments, we worried. And it was also easy to see that ratings based on one number assigned to a country per year would not be nuanced enough to make valid comparisons always from year to year or even within a single country. The measures just were not sensitive enough to variation, and therefore the numeric data wasn't necessarily transparent as to whether respect for human rights was improving or not. So that's one of the points we wanted to make. As my methodology teachers taught me, and most methodologists I think would agree, just saying that the data is poor is an easy criticism. And what matters really is understanding the existing data and being able to calibrate techniques and conclusions to make good use of what we have in a way that permits us to gauge the certainty of the findings. And sometimes that means searching for new observations. So since that paper came out, people like Chris Ferris and Baekwon Park have used new quantitative techniques showing that there does seem to be some evidence of general improvement in human rights over time. It's such a general question, though. Chris in particular says that standards have changed, and so those are reflected in the reports and then will become embedded in the coding. It's not that the coding is bad. And Baekwon and his colleagues have done, they've done analysis of the taxonomy of human rights reports that suggest that there just are many more recognized human rights, and we can, he can plot that out. So his paper was called Human Rights is Increasingly Plural. But having said all that, even if human rights are improving, they're not improving everywhere. And so for me, the more important question, especially ongoing, is whether social scientists are paying due attention to the time, place, and manner of violations and using means appropriate to the information available. One issue that Kathryn and I mentioned that few have picked up on was that we observed that just by eyeballing the data, extreme deterioration in human rights levels can occur very quickly if we're talking about political violence, and much more quickly than the slower institutional change that may be required to prevent or repair violations. And so this suggests, to the point about liberal democracies, that while established democracies may have resilience against human rights violations, they are not impervious to deterioration. So hard-won improvements may fall quickly, and when they do, that may leave lasting impact. So in my view, and Michael, you say this, that in your points, that optimism, pessimism may be kind of moral positions. And I think whether a person is an optimist or pessimist about the long haul of human rights, it's prudent to always query the potential for change. I wanted to make a couple of points that related to the fact that whatever activists and lawyers can learn from social scientists, which was a question that was posed in your message to us, social science can learn from activists, and as Robert kind of suggested, who are using these concepts in the following ways. One is to look at records of activism. Those are historically important, not just for arguments about the limitations or triumphs of human rights, although they can speak to that, but the data can be generated by studying the systematic efforts of activists over time. And I've written a paper with Bijou about activist generated data, and that's something I'm becoming more interested in. Another thing that we can learn is how activists have negotiated global to local power and informational dynamics, especially since the 1990s. And observing these efforts is informative of the limits and potential of human rights as a concept. Regarding law, sometimes activists don't wait for invitations from law or existing global institutional arrangements. Instead, they push law. And an argument I make in my most recent book is that human rights practice has become a resource that enables the pursuit of justice globally, but that a changing sense of justice for activists has also shaped the profile of human rights by, well, one example is the taking up of economic and social rights by major human rights organizations. And another example was the taking up of human rights by groups like Oxfam on development starting in the 90s. So these changes suggest that many social science so-called lessons of history, or many lessons of history and social science, so-called, should be considered provisional at best. This can be frustrating when we want complete answers, but I think it fits well with an observational outlook. And that makes the optimism versus pessimism debate maybe too simple in how it characterizes scholarship. In fact, I think it is too simple. So I'll stop there and look forward to more conversation.
Thank you all very much. Obviously, a very rich number of questions. I wonder I could take up this question of deep history, perhaps in order to get out of the way, since Sam seemed skeptical about it. I suppose it's partly my background as a fairly traditional political theorist, where you take courses, the so-called Plato to NATO courses. I once took a course in political theory at the University of Minnesota, which consisted of 3 semesters, and we reached Plato at the end of the first semester. So that was really deep history. I used to explain that approach to my students, talking about political theory generally, but it would apply to human rights. The history of political theory is a kind of treasure house of ideas, some of which we now believe in, some of which we've rejected. But one of the reasons for studying the history of political theory and of human rights is that we often make assumptions in ordinary political debate and discourse and activism, which have a history and have a history of controversy. And it's illuminating to look at historical periods when, say, democracy was very controversial, to see why some quite intelligent people weren't terribly keen on the idea, and other people were. And that, however we come up, it should, the John Stuart Mill idea is that encountering ideas you don't like very much can strengthen the ideas you do have, that the deep history of political thought has a considerable value, and that would apply to the history of human rights and the history of democracy. I don't know, Sam, if you'd like to, or Robert, or both, of course, or any of you like to just comment on that.
Absolutely. No, well, I think there's a lot to what you said. I just want to make clear that, even before the barrage of criticism I received, I never rejected deep history as such. I mean, clearly there are occasions for telling deep histories. For example, the Catholic Church has a deep history. Oppression has a deep history. Practices like slavery in particular have deep histories. So what's only been at stake, in my view, is what we learn from deep histories of human rights, what those histories disguise. Now, let me concede that you can learn something. And just as an example, if you were to reconstruct, as Robert and many others have, a kind of the revolutionary debate conceptually about rights and contrast it with, say, Jeremy Bentham's views about welfare, you see that contest going on today. I mean, and before he sort of embraced human rights, Eric Posner, was essentially making the welfarist critique of human rights not that differently from the way Bentham did. So, I mean, if it helps philosophically illuminate that debate by showing that it's old, then I'm more than for it. I intervened contesting deep histories because it seemed to me that the histories that were being written were only deep. and we're disguising something about the radical novelty, in large part, about human rights practice today. And I just thought we should have a new conversation, much more focused than before. Now, that move I tried to make is itself old now, and there's a lot of water under the bridge. I'm not kind of going around trying to make that point over and over, even though I'm invited to conversations all the time about it like this one. So, as I see it, scholarship is political. We'll get back to, whether anything's not political later, whether social science is political and so forth. But I made that intervention kind of contesting deep history at a moment that's long ago. I still would defend that by and large, it remains most important to focus on the recency of human rights as a practice and what we still need to do with and to it. But that doesn't mean that for certain important purposes, it's interesting and valuable to even look conceptually at longer histories.
Well, I think I should say, I had moments when I thought perhaps we all agree about everything if we state our views carefully enough, because there was much in your 2010 book, which I found both extremely interesting and quite persuasive. So I think that there are points at which we could agree. Robert, I don't know if you have any further thoughts about deep history, and then we can move on to other issues.
I suppose just to say that I think that the reaction to deep history, I think it's been a central feature of the cultural turn in historical studies, really, because what there's been is a general pushback against teleological grand narratives, whether those narratives are Marxist or liberal or Whiggish or whatever. And so I think that every concept, deserves that, revisionist view that Samuel took on human rights. I think that I don't really have. I think that the main point that I was trying to make in my critical discussion of Samuel's book is really, and that piece that I wrote was the first part of it was part of one large article that became two articles. That was me expressing a worry about what I was talking about with reference to Charles Bates and Andrea Giovanni, the danger of reification in political concepts, where a political concept, its contingency and its contestability gets lost when it becomes exclusively associated with a set of practices and institutions, such that it cannot be understood in any other way. We get bewitched by that one picture in the Wittgensteinian language of human rights. And I think that a broader political point that I would make about that is that's just something we have to do with all our political concepts. So, freedom is the obvious example. It's a political concept that is always, I would say, misused by a lot of people that I wouldn't trust. But if we simply gave up on it and said, well, that's freedom, I think we would be doing ourselves a disservice as a community. I think that the concepts that inform our, broadly liberal Western discourse are really up for grabs in that sense. I think that my worry about the association of human rights with kind of the interventionist policies of Western imperialism, cultural and military imperialism, was just really motivated by that. I think that I think that deep history has. I think that there's a distinction to be drawn between a deep history as telling a story about a concept from its furthest most family resemblance roots, and doing the more kind of peril diving exercise where you go back to the past and look at certain discussions or theorizations that from which you might want to glean a certain understanding that illuminates our contemporary discussions. I think they're different. I think that the genuine, the sincere attempt to tell deep histories seems to me to be a very fraught one and a very dangerous one, because I think that unless you are very clear in your book, Michael, about the family resemblance idea, that human rights has with certain ancestors. If you don't handle with care, then I think you do end up with the kind of teleology that Samuel was pushing back against.
Oh, thanks very much. Just one last question on history for Anne. I don't know if you know this recent paper by Singranelli and Filipov about, I don't know if you have a view about how far things that happened quite a long time ago have a big influence on what is possible now or what is likely to happen now. In other words, explaining the current human rights situation, what is the relative role of short-term factors and long-term factors? Parsons and Chilton were influenced by work in development economics, and some development economists say what happened 200 or 300 years ago at least correlates with the state of economies now, and particularly the ability of new countries to develop. And they've applied that to human rights in a controversial way. So do you have a view about the relative balance between long-term factors and short-term factors in explaining what's going on in human rights?
I think, well, that's a tough question, and I'm not familiar with that paper that I don't think that you're talking about by Singranelli and Filipov, although I did look for it before the panel. I tell my students that you can't explain a recent event with something that happened long ago. I mean, at least in terms of precipitating factors, if you're trying to do causal analysis. But so I don't know if the historians would have more to say about this, but in terms of the social science work, I would say it's really difficult to show causality that way unless it's about, and I guess I might try to reduce it to the attitudes of the individuals involved. So how do groups see their reasons for action? And to that extent, so I'm out of my depth when it comes to historical explanation and training in those approaches. But in terms of social science and causal explanation, I think you have to see the short-term and long-term as related, but the first thing I do is look for the precipitants. I don't know if that gets to your question at all, Michael.
Well, some have held the view, well, there's quantitative statistical studies which show that if you try to explain, for example, why some post-colonial societies have done relatively well economically and some have not, and you can apply this to human rights performance, it correlates very strongly with long-term factors such as institutions. In development economics, there's a lot of emphasis on the countries that developed what they consider appropriate institutions relatively early are now richer than countries that didn't. And that holds with very few exceptions. Now, there are exceptions, because there always are in social science, but it's broadly true.
Yeah,
that's what they say.
That relates to an observation that I left off my notes at the beginning, but might be relevant now. And that is, I think social scientists and probably human rights lawyers are very concerned with dealing with the last thing that caused the violation. So, and that, you can see that in when we look at how Amnesty International tried to influence human rights law, et cetera. That sort of, here's a violation, there's low law, let's make a law, then let's mobilize around it. But, another way to think more long-term that relates very much to what you just said is something that, applied health sciences are starting to pick up, which is if you see a patient that's doing well, ask what's going right. And so that I think relates to this issue of good, strong institutions that, as I said, do take a long time to develop.
Okay, thanks very much. I think time's going on, as it always does, and perhaps we should take 1 or 2 questions from our audience. Not sure about this one, but I'll try. I don't know whether we've answered it or not. One of our audience says, oh, I think I've lost that question, to clarify the difference between conceptions of human rights from the past and the present. Does anyone want to take that up briefly? I think we've partly covered it. When we're saying that the concept of human rights now is different from what it was in the past, someone wants clarification of that. Anyone want to?
Well, I'll just repeat my old argument just for the sake of eliciting the attacks that Michael and Robert have leveled against it, and just kind of bringing us all up to date. Again, I'm not claiming that at a certain level of abstraction, the concept of human rights in the past and present is the same one. But I emphasized the what we would now, with some philosophers call the functional difference between announcing human rights to justify a revolution, to found a state, or in the case of the French Revolution, to change the nature of political authority within the state, to justify, in particular, the use of violent tools to do so. In other words, to have a revolution on the one hand, and contemporary human rights politics on the other, which seemed to me a world away. They often, I should be clear, can be about revising the terms of a space of citizenship. Even then, as in, say, the European human rights regime, it's as part of a transnational legal order, which is new. But more regularly, it's about our relation to non-citizens and the activism which we undertake on their behalf forbids, among other things, their own violence, their own revolutions, where we favor things like, checks in the mail and lawsuits filed and informational forms of politics to name and shame. So, to me, you can say that, oh, it's all the same thing at a certain level of abstraction. But to me, it's a reversal. That was the main argument that I made all those years ago. And whether, it stands, I let others decide.
I think that even if we are talking about the idea at a very abstract level, there are important differences between older articulations of theories of rights and contemporary ones. And I think the most significant one is the detachment of the ascription of the status necessary to be a bearer of human rights or a bearer of universal rights, and some sort of thick teleological or theological metaphysics. And that sort of happens in the 18th century, really. I mean, whether or not we can bracket the issue of Samuel's thesis, but just in terms of, that's an obvious difference between an earlier understanding, historical understanding of rights, which is embedded in law of nature, a kind of ascriptive, thick metaphysical law, and something that is much thinner and based on a non-theological account of our status as equally relevant moral entities. So that's something that is, even at the high level abstraction, differs older theories of rights from contemporary ones.
Okay, I have a question here, which is actually a question about Poland, so rather narrowly focused, but perhaps has a general implication. Questioner seems concerned about debates in Poland about abortion being made illegal, and whether the question actually is, doesn't this feed against the argument of having separate perceptions of rights for people? But it might, I suppose, raise the question about, even in Europe, although, as Sam said, there are different various ethical universalisms in the world, even within Europe, which is officially committed to pretty much the same idea of human rights, there are significant differences in interpreting the implications of that. And when you move beyond Europe, those differences tend to become greater. So what does that say about the idea of the universalism of human rights? I don't know, Sam, if you'd like to briefly comment on that. I don't know if you want to comment on Poland, but the general question of different.
I mean, I think it's an excellent question, because it seems as if it's you could have a lot of competition, you know, and you know, sometimes it becomes most intense when you actually share a lot, and you know, again, Christianity and Islam, if you look at them, are very similar, actually. You know, much of the ethical content in the sacred texts and so on is the same. And then there are minute differences, and you know, there's a millennial war going on. Now that could happen within human rights, where you have, you know, a general agreement about many things, but then, you know, substantial disagreement on some points. And, you know, you could take the Polish example, which I think is reasonable to cite, since, you know, in 1948, the right to an abortion, you know, at least to the best of my understanding, wasn't understood to be a human right. And now it may be protected under certain understandings of human rights law. And thus people who agree on most human rights could disagree fervently on that one. In my country, you know, Donald Trump, who was, you know, regarded the world over as an enemy of human rights, set up a commission on human rights, or as he and his servants called it, inalienable rights. And again, what was at stake was not repudiating human rights, but defining them in slightly different ways. Amazingly, the commission ended up being more favorable towards economic and social rights in particular than any, you know, prior presidential administration had been. So, you know, I think there's just going to always be an ongoing struggle over the moral content, whether having, you know, our highest, you know, ideals framed in terms of human rights, or if there's agreement about that, what the content is.
Anne or Robert, or both, but not at the same time. Anne, do you have a response to problems raised by, even within certain regions with fairly similar cultures, you get significant differences of interpretation of human rights?
I don't think I have anything to add to what Sam said. That sounded like a great answer to me.
Okay, good. Robert?
Yeah, just would echo what Sam said. I think that one of the things that philosophers try and do is sort of tame the inevitable conflicts over the substance or the substantive demands of some of our normative values like human rights. And whereas politics is the playing out, I guess, of the disagreements that can be captured under this very, very general umbrella term of human rights.
Okay, I have two questions from John Packer, and I think they raise two kinds of issues. One has to do with religion and human rights. He says, thanks, Sam, for returning human rights to its original linkage origin arising from violent conflicts, brackets, peace. This has always been expressed in the principal human rights instruments, but often neglected by human rights advocates. On the limits of human rights, far from a religion as a normative framework, human rights is only one among others, notably rule of law, legality, or good governance. Doesn't this mean that the human rights movement must look beyond merely cataloguing violations and admonishing, and with some humility engage with other religions? I don't know whether anyone wants to take that up. So it seems connected to the last question in a way. Obviously, in Poland, religion is important. If I could dare to rephrase it, is the movement too secular?
Well, I suppose I'd resist the idea that there is a single human rights movement. I mean, what would it look like for the human rights movement to engage with religions? I suppose is what I would struggle to understand.
Yeah. Well, Sam, Anne, do you have a view about this?
Well, so, I think this is a really hard question, but I'll just say that, there was an era in which, human rights ideas and law and movements traded on the idea that they were already agreed upon, not controversial, not political. And again, that's so different from the revolutionary era, when human rights were about contesting the regime and replacing it. And I tried to show, how, in a sense, from a position of weakness, people began to say, no, human rights are things we already all agree about, no matter what else we think, and no matter what kind of political regime is in place, and so forth. And, I think John's question illustrates that, it's very scary, because to concede that, no, we don't all agree. No one ever did. And then the question is, on what basis do we impose values that we hold on others who don't hold them? If we can't indulge in the pretense that, in a sense, there's already an apolitical agreement, well, what's the basis of this thing? So you can say, John, that we should be, I guess you're saying, more honest and say this is a war of gods and demons, as Max Weber, another social scientist, called it, where some religion is going to win, and maybe it's the religion of human rights. Or we have to figure out a way of reestablishing human rights more credibly as something that's apolitical and uncontroversial. I think that's a dubious hope. So I think we really should say human rights are a controversial ethical proposal. Among other things, it requires major political change everywhere in the world against the established powers, and then figure out what to do about that.
Anne, do you have a view about what happens, or what should happen when human rights comes up against religious differences, sometimes in an uncomfortable way?
Well, the thought occurred to me that if human rights is a liberal principle, then it oughtn't to be considered a religion. And I know that completely goes against what what Sam and other people have suggested, that it is sometimes a matter of faith and a concept. But I think the only pragmatic solution is what Jack Donnelly suggests, which is the sense that how human rights are applied in different cultures is going to vary. But that doesn't really solve the problem. And in fact, this question comes up in my classes where, and it comes up in your book, if religions conflict and we have a right to religion, then what does that mean for how to adjudicate? So I might retreat to the liberal concept of human rights as a way to solve that problem, but we know that politically it doesn't always solve the problem.
Okay, thank you. There's another issue raised by John Packer, which Sam alluded to a little earlier, about the relationship between peace and human rights. There's a book published in 2015, edited by two Finnish scholars, a collection of somewhat skeptical essays on human rights, one of which is on the relationship of human rights to the peace movement, and the fact that the peace movement largely ignored each other, perhaps to the detriment of both. So Sam, you raised this a bit earlier. I wonder whether you'd like to say anything further about the relationship between peace as a value and as a practical goal and human rights.
Sure. So, I mean, I defer to Anne Marie, but I assume we still think, that the data shows that, human rights outcomes are, at their worst in wartime, whether international or internal armed conflict. And I think it was to its credit that the Universal Declaration, propounded in the shadow of the Second World War, was committed to the priority on international peace that the United Nations Charter was supposed to consecrate. And that's in part why there was no politics of human rights interventionism for many decades thereafter, because in a certain sense Adolf Hitler had justified his interventionism on grounds of humanitarianism and so forth. And for a long time, peace movements were much more prominent than human rights movements, not just in the 19th century, but as late as the Vietnam era. You can look through international discourse about the Vietnam War, and the phrase human rights is not mentioned. And obviously, peace matters in those debates. So what's happened since? I think a deprioritization of peace, and you can see why, especially after 1989, when it becomes possible for even human rights wars to be credible, especially given the reasonable contention that peace can be unjust, and despots would be great to topple them if we could make the world a better place in doing so, rather than create anarchy like in Libya and so many other places that we've done. So I think we've had a learning experience since Vietnam about what happens when we substitute for peace movements with human rights movements. I think it's totally important to have them in the case of international armed conflict, intractable violence where it's not clear how you achieve peace. Although even there, like consider the Colombian situation, there can be a very legitimate debate about whether concerns about accountability and justice kind of forestall or interfere with peace. But in the international system, I think we've seen, great power wars, which have set humanity back tremendously, often in the name of human rights, or, with let's say, most concern about the manner of their conduct. So like what to me, I look back and say, because Anne Marie's worked on this, you had an immense campaign around torture, which then was very significant in challenging the American war on terror in 2004, 5, 6. And the result of it, though, wasn't peace. It was a more humane form of torture-free counter-terrorist war, which goes on. And so why not, get some peace in the mix, especially because, again, as a matter of outcomes, that's what matters most if you care about human rights.
Thanks. Anne, I wonder whether you could say, it seems to me that the human rights movement has been fairly confused on the question of intervention. The intervention in Vietnam was bad. Failure to intervene in Rwanda was bad. Intervening in Yugoslavia, we're not quite sure whether it was good or bad. Am I being fair? The human rights people, yes, find it very difficult to reach agreement on interventions.
Well, I was going to comment on from a slightly different position, just to say that as the idea of human rights has, I think, become more important in global discourse, and I think I can pull this out of what's been said already, this classic potential opposition between peace and justice. Now we've got human rights. Is human rights a tool for justice? And if it is, does it have to be peaceful? So in some ways, I think that's where the tricky part lies. And if we and I'm resonating with what Sam said about kind of the maybe a little bit of the weakness of the human rights argument. But the weakness is also that perhaps human rights could be like law, a way to adjudicate conflict in a peaceful manner. The problem is that once we're talking about sovereignty and intervention and international relations, then a whole other set of interest-based things comes up. So intervention then becomes is obviously not peaceful, and it can't rely on adjudication. So these things worry me. I don't see, for me, I think intervention, and this is not everyone's going to agree with this. It's hard for me to see that intervention, it usually brings its own problems. It's like the wrong kind of tool to improve human rights, if that's the objective.
Robert, I don't know if this is your area, but feel free to comment if you wish.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, it's human rights and peace. It's a strange situation because the two concepts seem to have such obvious overlaps and relationships, and yet they can come apart. And I think that which one you prioritize will depend on contingent political circumstances. I think that certainly I can sympathize with the view that the political campaign of human rights has had a certain hubris about it that has undermined peace in such a way that I can definitely I can see the case for prioritizing peace, but I think it's very much it's a question that is not settleable, in matters of principle. It's really a contingent one for me.
Right. Well, I don't see any more questions from the audience. I have further ones to develop some of these ideas, perhaps. It relates to something that Sam said earlier about the relationship. I mean, it follows on from this peace issue, the relationship between human rights and just about everything else that we should be properly concerned with. That would, of course, include the environment and global inequality that Sam has written very powerfully about. I'm thinking of something that the economist Amartya Sen once said. I want to sort of say quite properly about limitations of human rights and some of the problems of human rights, and that's absolutely proper. We should. Let's say sort of come back to defend the idea a little. Amartya Sen once said in relation to development issues, poverty issues, that the case for combining them with human rights was that if we recognize people's human rights, do we know what they think they really need? And any development policy ought to certainly be taking that into account. So that it's quite important, whatever the solutions we favor for problems of global inequality, poverty, and environment, having a strong human rights component is very important. There's Sam, with you, like whether you agree or disagree with that.
I'm personally persuaded by those like Henry Shue who have argued that we shouldn't engage in a kind of ranking exercise where we prioritize any kinds of rights over one another. And indeed, I would extend that view. I mean, I think it's very hard for people in the developed West to claim that now's the time to rank human rights above development when, we engaged in centuries of brutal rule of the world to become rich, and, didn't care that much about human rights in doing so. And so not that at all, suggests that we should you know, allow others to, you know, place human rights on the periphery in the name of development now, but that I think we should consider human rights as some priorities amongst others. That's my general view, you know, across the board. And, you know, I've made it a case, you know, briefly for prioritizing peace relative to human rights more than we have. And I just would say that to me, we shouldn't insist on an absolute priority of human rights to development for those who, you know, are want to prioritize, you know, material well-being. So, you know, I think we should, you know, expand Shu's view. Now, the only trouble with saying that is I assume that from a kind of mainstream perspective, the whole point of human rights is that they're about the selective prioritization of some values over others. And Shu tried to expand the list to include economic and social rights. But if you allow everything to be prioritized, then nothing's prioritized. And I don't know, I'm happy to embrace that consequence. You know, I just am not as sure as other people exactly, you know, what the grounds are for prioritizing human rights over other ends among the good things in life. And, you know, peace should count, equality should count, development certainly is what most people have wanted in recent centuries. And I think then the challenge is to make sure that it's plausibly consistent with human rights rather than trampling them.
We have a new question from the audience, which is in this area about the relationship between human rights and social justice movements and economic power. Well, I wonder if I could ask, it's a rather long question, but I wonder if I could ask Anne, since both Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have, after a long period of resistance, taken up economic and social rights. And could you comment on what kind of problems that's raised for them, and whether it's still quite controversial within those organizations, I think, and outside? Could you say something about how human rights organizations, which generally started out being concerned only with civil and political rights, have been persuaded to take up economic and social rights? Has that been a good thing or not?
Yeah, well, I think it's the right thing. I think that Shu is right that we need both security and subsistence rights. And I think that, you know, there was a big dust up in early 2000s about this, and Kenneth Roth of Human Rights Watch wrote a piece basically saying, here's why it's so hard to talk about economic and social rights. And it's because there's not a clear causal chain, and because it's very difficult to ask governments to reallocate their funds internally. But since then, Human Rights Watch especially has really, you know, they started by saying, well, we're going to work on anti-discrimination protections that can be extended to economic, social, and cultural needs. And I think that's been pretty effective as a strategy. And Amnesty has done something similar. It's been really difficult, though, because some of the old techniques Sorry.
I think I slightly lost you. Let's go on, please.
Sorry. Well, the naming and shaming techniques don't work so great for economic and social rights. So I do think it's necessary. And then what I've also observed is that human rights is so prominent that people are starting to claim them before the experts say they exist. So it's very much a kind of discursive activity that people use at home, meaning domestically, to talk about social and economic needs, like healthcare as a human right in the US. So in some ways, it might not matter. Well, it does matter, but politically it may not matter because people are asking for further development of these things as rights. And that's, I think, partly a consequence of the popularity of human rights. And whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I'm not sure. But I do think that human rights has become a tool that regular people and activists are seeing as pretty useful for pursuing economic and social rights.
Thanks, Robert. Political philosophers seem to have discovered recent years global justice as a key thing they should be concerned about. Would you like to say whether that's promising development within philosophy?
Yeah, well, it's interesting to me that whenever
I say,
oh, sorry, yes. It's interesting to me that whenever political philosophers talk about human rights, one of the things that they seem to agree upon is that there are very few of them. They all come up with very much shorter lists than you ever see in actual political discourse. And so whether it is James Griffin or Charles Bates or Amartya Sen, there's an agreement on that. And I often wonder why that is and why this modesty about the demands of human rights when our political discourse seems to suggest that they are, ever unfurling. I think Sen is an interesting case because he actually used the capabilities theory that he develops, and him and Martha Nussbaum actually used the language of human rights to try and offer a theory that is both abstractly universalist but also contextually sensitive. And I think he exemplifies someone who's trying to do interesting things with human rights. Global justice, that's a whole different debate, because I think that a lot of people who posit ideas of global justice don't necessarily have ideas of human rights at the forefront of them. I think one way of bringing the two together is to think in terms of economic and social rights as human rights, which is something that a lot of activists and ordinary citizens do anyway. So I think that, I think that the global justice debate in political philosophy is really mired in the question of ideal versus real theory and whether or not we should defer to the actual existence of individual, sovereign bordered states. So I don't necessarily think that is the most fertile ground for thinking about human rights in philosophy at the moment.
Thanks very much. I'm afraid our time is just about up, so I think I should end by thanking very much indeed Samuel Moyne, Robert Lamb, Anne-Marie Clark, and also Katia Al-Khatib for all her brilliant administrative support, and Felipe Ferreira for his technical support. And finally, to thank the audience for their questions and for their attendance. Thank you all very much and enjoy the rest of your day, which I think is the traditional way of ending a webinar nowadays. Thank you again. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.